The first time Daniel Mercer stepped onto his own porch after 20 years, he heard the sound of an auctioneer's voice drifting across the yard, going once, going twice. For a second, he thought the man had the wrong house. Then he looked up and saw the chipped white columns he had painted by hand as a young husband, the dent in the screen door from the time his daughter had slammed it in tears, the old wind chime that his wife had hung over the steps because she said a home should always sound alive. And standing in the driveway, smiling like a man who owned the place, was Daniel's younger brother. Calvin Mercer lifted a hand in lazy greeting. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "if it isn't the ghost." A few people laughed nervously. A few more just stared. Daniel didn't laugh. He was too busy trying to breathe. He was older now, thinner than he should have been. One shoulder bent from an old injury that never healed right. His face marked with lines that 20 years of war, hunger, and silence had carved into it. The army jacket on his back had been issued in a VA clinic. The boots had been donated. He looked nothing like the man who had kissed his daughter's forehead at 8 years old and promised he'd be home for Christmas. But the woman standing on the porch knew exactly who he was. Emily Mercer's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, as if her mind refused to trust what her heart was already screaming. She was 30 now, tall and composed, dressed in a dark blazer like someone who had spent years learning how to survive rooms full of people who wanted to take things from her. In her right hand was a thick manila folder. She looked at Calvin. Then she looked at the auctioneer. Then she looked at the neighbors gathered in the yard, and with a voice so steady it made the whole crowd go quiet, Emily said, "The auction is canceled." Calvin gave a sharp, dismissive laugh. "On what authority?" Emily stepped down from the porch, walked straight to the hood of Calvin's truck, and slapped the folder onto it hard enough to make the papers inside jump. "On the authority of bank records, military records, probate fraud, forged signatures, and one very live man whose home you tried to sell while lying to everyone in this town." Nobody said a word. Then Emily turned toward Daniel. The hard line in her face broke all at once. Her lips trembled. Her knees almost gave way. And in the middle of the driveway, with the auctioneer still holding the little wooden gavel in his hand, Emily Mercer fell to her knees in front of the father she had not seen in 20 years. "Dad," she whispered, like the word itself was a prayer. Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh. He dropped his cane, rushed forward, and caught her before she hit the ground. For a second, nobody moved. The whole yard seemed frozen. Even Calvin's smile had died on his face. Then Emily lifted her head, tears streaking down her cheeks, and said the words that would ruin her uncle's life. "I knew you were alive," she said, "and I made sure you'd be here today to hear the truth." No one in Millstone, Missouri saw that coming. Not Calvin, not the neighbors, not even Daniel. But to understand why Emily's words hit like a hammer, you have to go back to the year her father vanished. Daniel Mercer left for war in the spring of 2006, when Emily was 8 and still believed her father was the strongest man on earth. He was not the sort of man who made speeches about honor. He was a mechanic by trade, a stubborn, practical man with grease under his nails and a soft spot for old country songs. He fixed pickup trucks for half the county, never charged widows, and always came home smelling like oil and sunlight. His wife, Anna, used to say that Daniel could bring dead things back to life if he had enough time and a wrench. He laughed when she said it. Then he kissed her and told her not to give up the porch light. Emily remembered that part more than anything else. The night he left, he crouched in front of her bedroom door with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder and tucked a hand under her chin. "You take care of your mom," he told her. "I'm 8, Emily said, trying not to cry. He smiled. "Then you're 8, and very important." She giggled through her tears and threw her arms around his neck. He held her so tightly she could feel his heart beating against her cheek. Then he stood, looked at Anna one last time, and said, "I'll be back before you know it." That was the last time Emily saw him in daylight. 3 months later, the army came knocking. It was a Wednesday. Emily remembered that because she had a spelling test the next morning, and she was furious that grown-ups cared enough about war to ruin her week, but not enough to stop it. Two men in uniform stood on the porch with their hats in their hands. Anna knew before they spoke. People always say they know, but Emily had never understood how. Her mother just went pale. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe. The men said there had been an explosion, an ambush, confusion, missing personnel. Missing personnel. Those words did not mean dead. Not yet. The army told Anna there was no body, no confirmed remains, no closure. Calvin Mercer arrived before the men left the driveway. He was Daniel's younger brother by 5 years, handsome in a rough, easy way, always looking like life had handed him better luck than he deserved. He came with casseroles, loud sympathy, and eyes that never stopped calculating. He hugged Anna too long, spoke to neighbors too quickly, and began saying, "When the insurance comes through," before the week was over. Anna hated him immediately. Emily didn't understand why until much later. At first, Calvin acted useful. He drove Anna to meetings. He handled phone calls. He told people he was just helping his sister-in-law, because family had to stick together. Then he started suggesting things. He suggested Anna should sign paperwork for temporary management of Daniel's accounts. He suggested the military payout would be easier if he handled it. He suggested it was unfair for a woman to shoulder everything alone when there was a man right there willing to step up. Anna refused him for months. Then the bills started piling up. The water heater died. The truck broke down. Emily needed braces. The army paperwork moved slowly. The insurance money never came. Calvin's wife, Tracy, showed up with invoices and pity and that smiling voice people use when they're trying to sound helpful while taking something from you. And then one night, after Emily had gone to bed, Anna sat at the kitchen table with a stack of unopened envelopes and cried so hard she couldn't breathe. She signed one paper, then another. Calvin told her it was only temporary, only while Daniel's status was unresolved, only until things were clear. What he didn't tell her was that the papers were giving him access to Daniel's bank account, the house title, and the family trust Daniel's father had left behind years earlier. By the time Anna realized it, Calvin had already started moving his things into the house. He and Tracy turned Daniel's old den into their office. They took over the kitchen. They told Emily to be quiet when the adults were talking. They told the neighbors Daniel was presumed lost, which was a careful little lie that sounded kinder than the truth and worked almost as well. Anna fought them every day. But grief weakens people in ways nobody warns you about. She aged fast. The sadness settled into her bones. She stopped laughing the way she used to. Then, 4 years after Daniel disappeared, she got sick. The doctor said cancer. Calvin said, "We'll help." What he meant was, "We'll keep what's left." Anna died before Emily turned 13. At the funeral, Calvin gave the eulogy. He stood in front of the tiny church with one hand on the pulpit and said Daniel would have been proud of the family they had become. Emily almost shouted in the middle of the service. Instead, she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. After that, the house became something uglier than a home. Calvin and Tracy kept Emily around because the town would have noticed if they'd thrown her out, and because a daughter was useful when people started asking questions. She cooked. She cleaned. She worked summers at Calvin's roadside diner for less than minimum wage. She learned how to read adult faces the way other kids learned sports scores. Tracy made sure she never forgot who fed her. Calvin made sure she never forgot who owned the roof over her head. "Be grateful," he'd say whenever Emily looked at him too long. "Grateful for what?" she would mutter under her breath. "For not being alone." That line stayed with her for years. At school, Emily was the girl whose father had died overseas and whose mother had died from stress, which made people speak to her in softer voices than they used with other kids. Soft voices can be cruel, too. They make pity sound like charity. They make you feel like something fragile everyone is doing a favor by not breaking. Emily learned to make herself small. She got good grades because grades didn't ask her for anything. She got a part-time job when she was 16. She saved every cent. She applied for every scholarship she could find. She read legal documents with the same intensity other girls read magazines, because if she could understand paper, maybe paper could stop hurting her. At 18, she found the first real crack in Calvin's story. She was cleaning out an old filing cabinet in the back room of the diner when she found a yellow envelope addressed to Daniel Mercer, marked with a return stamp from a VA office in St. Louis. Calvin had never bothered to shred it. Inside was a benefits summary and a note about a service-connected claim. Emily took the papers home and studied them all night. Then she found another envelope, and another. By dawn, she knew 3 things. Her father had been declared MIA, not dead. Calvin had been receiving government payments in Daniel's name through a temporary guardianship that should have expired years ago, and the house title had been quietly transferred into a trust that Calvin controlled. That was the night Emily stopped being a frightened little girl and started becoming dangerous. She went to college on scholarship an hour away, studied law and accounting, and returned every weekend to the same house she hated. Calvin thought she was grateful to have a degree. Tracy thought she was lucky. Neither of them understood that Emily had spent 4 years learning how to dismantle men like them. Still, one question stayed lodged in her throat. Was Daniel really dead? Every official answer said maybe. The army had never recovered his body. There was no casket, no confirmation, no final report. Just silence, bureaucracy, and a family that had learned how to profit from silence. Emily never stopped looking. She contacted old service organizations. She called veterans' offices. She sent letters to missing persons units and humanitarian groups, and anyone who might know how to search old war records. Most of them never wrote back. Some did, but the answers were always dead ends. One hospital in Germany had listed a John Mercer for 3 weeks in 2010, but the details didn't match. A Red Cross file in Turkey seemed promising until it vanished into a maze of privacy restrictions. For 6 years, nothing. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in March, Emily was at her desk at the county probate office when she saw a name in a file she had no business seeing. Daniel Mercer. Or rather, not his name exactly, but his old army identifier attached to a medical transport request. It had been filed under a sealed repatriation record from a federal contractor in Virginia. The file was small, almost too small, which made it suspicious. Emily's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her coffee. She spent 3 weeks digging through every channel she could legally, and almost legally use. She followed a paper trail through veteran relief agencies, hospital records, and one quiet Army liaison who finally gave her the truth in a low voice over the phone. Her father had been found alive the previous year in a rehabilitation facility outside Richmond. He had survived captivity. He had survived a convoy attack that had killed 3 others. For years, he had been moved through a chain of unofficial detentions, sick camps, and temporary holding sites before a humanitarian rescue operation finally got him out. The long years of captivity had left him damaged, half-starved, and badly injured, but alive. Alive. Emily had to sit down on the floor when she heard it. The liaison asked if she wanted to know where Daniel was now. She said yes. Then she spent the next 6 months planning something so precise and so ruthless that Calvin never stood a chance. Because Emily didn't just want her father back. She wanted him back in front of witnesses. She wanted every lie dragged into the light. And she wanted Calvin to hear the sound of his own ruin. The day the house auction was scheduled, Calvin believed he was winning. He had spent the last year pushing the old Mercer property into foreclosure through a chain of forged liens, unpaid taxes, and legal manipulation. The town believed the house had been abandoned by a dead soldier and salvaged by the brother who stepped in when no one else would. Calvin had even put on a fake charity event for local veterans, shaking hands for the cameras and pretending to be a patriot. He was good at pretending. That morning, he stood in the driveway in a pressed shirt, handing out cookies and acting like the sale was a community celebration. Tracy fluttered around him in pearls she had no right to wear, smiling at anyone who looked bored enough to believe her. Then Emily arrived. She came alone at first, carrying the folder that would end everything. Calvin saw her and smiled. assuming she had come to beg for money or sign some last-minute form. Instead, she walked right past him, up to the auctioneer, and said, "You can stop. This property was fraudulently obtained." The auctioneer blinked. "Miss, I'm Emily Mercer, legal representative for the true owner of this property." Calvin laughed so hard one of the neighbors turned to look. "Your daddy's dead, sweetheart." Emily didn't even look at him. She just lifted the folder and said, "No, he isn't." At that moment, the side gate opened. Daniel Mercer stepped through. The whole yard changed. It was like the air itself sucked in. One woman gasped. Someone dropped a phone. Calvin's smile fell apart in slow motion. Tracy's hand flew to her chest like she had been shot. Daniel looked around the yard he had last seen as a father, not a ghost. His gaze landed on the old oak tree where Emily used to swing from a rope, on the porch where Anna used to sit in summer with an iced tea and a book, on the cracked step where Calvin's muddy boots used to rest when he thought no one was watching. Then he looked at Calvin, and something terrible and quiet moved across his face. "Hello, brother," Daniel said. Calvin recovered first, because men like him always try to recover first. He spread his hands. "Well, look at that. The ghost found his way home. This is some kind of sick stunt." Emily's eyes flashed. "You told the town my father abandoned us." Calvin's jaw tightened. "You told the army he was dead." "I told people what I had to tell them to keep this family together." "Don't lie," Emily said, her voice rising for the first time. "You told people what made you money." Tracy recovered enough to sneer. "Emily, you're upset. This is not the time." "Oh, it is exactly the time." Emily finally opened the folder and began pulling papers out one by one. "Here are the bank transfers. Here are the forged signatures. Here are the VA benefit records you collected for 12 years after your guardianship expired. Here is the sheriff's report from when you sold Daniel's pickup and reported it as abandoned property. Here is the tax lien you never should have been able to place. And here," she said, lifting one final sheet, "is the affidavit from the man who notarized the death declaration you told everyone was real." Calvin stared. For the first time in Emily's life, he had nothing to say. Daniel took one step forward, then another, his cane tapping against the driveway. "You told my wife I was dead." Calvin swallowed hard. "You were gone." Daniel's voice sharpened. "You told my daughter I walked away." "I gave her a home." Emily gave a bitter laugh, so sudden and raw that several people looked away in embarrassment. "You gave me a room over the diner and called it generosity." Calvin pointed at Daniel, his face reddening. "You can't just show up here after 20 years and expect everyone to bow down to you. You don't know what I sacrificed." Daniel stared at him a long moment. Then he said, "You're right. I don't know what you sacrificed. Tell me." Calvin hesitated. That was the mistake, because there was no answer that wouldn't expose him. Emily stepped closer to him. "You sacrificed my mother's dignity. You sacrificed my father's name. You sacrificed every dollar that should have gone to my college fund. And when that wasn't enough, you tried to sell the house he built." The neighbors were listening now, all of them. The auctioneer had tucked his gavel under one arm and looked like he wanted to disappear. Calvin tried one more lie. "Emily was confused. She's always had a temper. She doesn't understand legal matters." Emily smiled. It was not a kind smile. Then she turned to the deputy sheriff standing by the mailbox and said, "You can arrest him now." The deputy blinked. "On what charge?" Emily lifted the folder higher. "Forgery, fraud, theft, exploitation of federal benefits, unlawful transfer of estate assets, and attempted sale of property he had no authority to touch." "Those are allegations," Calvin snapped, but panic was already leaking through his voice. "No," Emily said. "Those are facts, and unlike you, I have receipts." The deputy looked uncertain, but Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope. "I also have something," he said. Everyone turned. Daniel's hand shook slightly as he opened it. Inside was a certified statement from the Department of the Army, a status correction, and a line that made Tracy go pale. The military had formally recognized Daniel as alive 6 months earlier. The notice had been sent to the last legal guardian on record. Calvin. He had received it, and ignored it. You knew, Daniel said quietly. Calvin's face drained of color. I didn't know it was final. You knew enough, Emily said. You knew enough to hide the letter from me. Tracy made a sharp sound. Calvin? He turned on her, suddenly vicious. Don't start. Emily looked at Tracy with cold, almost pitying disgust. You knew too. Tracy's lips parted, but nothing came out. That was her truth right there. Not innocence, not shock. Just the silence of a woman who had enjoyed the profits too much to ask where they came from. Daniel stepped closer. Where is my pension money? Calvin's mouth opened and closed. Where is it? Daniel repeated. Gone, Calvin muttered. Daniel's eyes hardened. Gone where? Bills. Taxes. Repairs. Emily barked out a laugh. Repairs? You mean the new kitchen in your lake house? Or the boat you bought with Dad's disability back pay? Or the cash you sent to Tracy's brother in Nevada after his gambling debt? The crowd started murmuring now. A few neighbors looked sick. Others looked furious. People loved a respectable liar until they realized they had been clapping for theft. Calvin took a step toward Emily, lowering his voice. You think you've won because you found some papers? You have no idea how much I've done for you. Daniel moved between them instantly, like 20 years had never passed. Don't talk to her like that. Calvin glared at him. You don't get to play father now. Daniel's face darkened. I never stopped being one. The words hit Emily like a physical blow. For 1 second she had to look away because the ache of it was too much. She had spent half her life pretending not to care that her father was gone. She had buoyed herself in work and study and anger because anger was easier. Now he was standing in front of her, and every old wound opened at once. Daniel saw it. Of course he saw it. His voice softened. She turned back, and the tears were there again, but she didn't let them fall. You don't get to say that like it erases 20 years, she whispered. You don't get to come back and expect forgiveness because you finally made it through. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Daniel said. I'm asking for a chance to tell you I tried. Emily's chin quivered. Everyone else in the yard was gone to her for the moment. There was only him, and the pain she had lived with so long it had become part of her bones. I know you tried, she said at last. I found you. Calvin's head snapped up. What? Emily turned slowly toward him, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, she looked truly dangerous. I found him 6 months ago. The words landed like a bomb. Calvin stared. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. You're lying. Emily shook her head. I tracked the medical transport, the hospital transfer, the humanitarian intake, and the repatriation case. I found the old Army liaison. I found the facility. I found Dad. Tracy's voice came out thin. You knew? Emily's eyes shone. I knew, and I didn't tell either of you. Calvin looked almost offended. Why the hell not? Because I knew you'd hide him again, Emily said, or destroy the paper trail, or make him look unstable so you could keep the house. So I waited. I got a court order. I placed a freeze on the auction, and I asked Dad to come home only when I had enough evidence to make sure you couldn't bury him again. The yard was silent, except for one dog barking 2 streets over. Daniel looked at her with something deeper than surprise. It was grief and pride and awe all tangled together. You did all this? He asked. Emily nodded once. You were worth looking for. That was the moment the whole town seemed to understand that Calvin had not been fighting some helpless little orphan. He had been fighting the daughter Daniel had left behind, and she had grown into a woman with a memory sharper than a blade. But Emily was not finished. She looked at the deputy. There's more. The deputy said nothing, but he didn't move either. Emily held up a small recorder. Calvin, you remember last month when you told me to come over and discuss the house transfer? Calvin's eyes widened in horror. She continued, You were very relaxed that day. You said, and I quote, The old man's probably dead for real this time, and if he isn't, nobody's going to believe him after 20 years. Tracy covered her mouth. Calvin lurched forward. That's private. Not anymore. Emily clicked the recorder, and Calvin's own voice spilled out across the yard. He heard himself bragging about forged signatures. heard himself admitting he knew Daniel had been declared alive, heard himself laughing about the money, heard himself saying the house would be out of that dead soldier's line before the end of the month. There was no way out after that. The deputy moved in first, then another officer who had arrived quietly during the shouting. Calvin took one startled step back, then another, as if he couldn't believe the world had finally decided not to tolerate him. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. Daniel looked at him with tired contempt. "No, Calvin. This is finally an understanding." When they cuffed Calvin, Tracy made a noise like a wounded animal and grabbed his arm. "Tell them it isn't true." He looked at her, and in that awful moment all of his charm vanished. The greed left nothing behind that resembled love. "You knew too," he spat. "You signed things because you told me we had to. You liked the house," he said bitterly. "You liked the money." The police separated them before the argument could become uglier, but the damage was done. Tracy would later admit what she had known. The prosecutor would later discover the paper trail that tied her to every transfer. But standing there, in the driveway, all she could do was cry and watch the life she had stolen come apart. The crowd slowly began to scatter, but not before half the town had seen enough to rewrite every story it had ever told about the Mercer family. By sunset, the auction was dead. The property lien had been frozen, and Calvin was in a holding cell, trying to explain why he had spent 2 decades pretending a man was dead for profit. Emily did not go with the police. She stayed on the porch. Daniel stood beside her in silence, both of them looking at the front door as if they expected Anna to open it and tell them dinner was getting cold. The house seemed smaller than Daniel remembered, or maybe he was larger now, scarred by all the years that had happened without him. Emily broke the quiet first. "I used to sit on this porch every night," she said. Daniel looked at her. "Waiting for me?" She shook her head. "Waiting to decide if I was allowed to miss you." That sentence hurt him so deeply, he had to look away. "I'm sorry," he said. She let out a shaky breath. "I know." They sat together on the front steps as dusk settled over the yard. For a while, neither of them spoke. The cicadas started up in the trees. Somewhere a truck passed on the road. The world kept moving, but the house remained still, holding all the years it had witnessed. Finally, Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded letter. He handed it to her without a word. Emily stared at the envelope. "What is this?" "Anna wrote it," he said. "Before she died. It was found with some of my old things after I got back into the country." Emily's fingers trembled as she opened it. Her mother's handwriting filled the page, careful and slanting as always. Anna wrote about missing Daniel, about Emily growing up too fast, about the lies Calvin told, about one thing, in particular, that made Emily stop breathing for a second. She had known Daniel might still be alive. Not for sure. Not enough to say it aloud, but enough to keep a tiny ember of hope alive in the dark. Enough to tell Emily, in the only language she had left, that grief should never be mistaken for certainty. At the bottom of the letter, Anna had written, "If he comes home, tell him I never believed he abandoned us. Tell him I waited as long as I could." Emily pressed the page to her chest and cried with a force that seemed to come from every year of her life at once. Daniel bowed his head and cried too. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just 2 people finally feeling the weight of all the years they had been forced to survive alone. The aftermath came fast. The federal investigators arrived within days. Calvin's accounts were frozen. The diner was seized after accountants found the missing payroll records and the false loans he had taken against the property. Tracy tried to negotiate immunity and got nothing. Neighbors who had once admired Calvin's confidence now testified against him with the eager shame of people clearing their consciences. Emily sat through every interview. She gave every record. She watched each lie get peeled apart by people with badges and clipboards and no patience left for his excuses. Calvin tried to say he had only been managing the family estate. Then the forged documents surfaced. He tried to say Emily had always hated him and made things up. Then the recording played in court. He tried to say Daniel had never really come back until it was convenient. Then the Army rep confirmed the repatriation records, the medical photos, the fingerprints, the entire forgotten chain of proof. The judge was not impressed. By the time the sentencing hearing arrived, Calvin looked older than Daniel, though he was younger by 10 years. Greed had a way of aging people faster than hardship. He stood in court in a wrinkled suit, staring at the floor while the prosecutor read aloud the amount he had stolen over the years. It was enough to make the whole room murmur. It was enough to pay for Emily's college and then some. It was enough to buy 3 houses in their county. It was enough to make every lie he had ever told feel small. When the judge finally announced the sentence, Calvin's face went blank in a way that was almost peaceful. Prison, restitution, asset forfeiture, years of supervised release after. Not the dramatic end people imagine when they dream of revenge. Just the cold, official kind of justice that arrives late but does arrive. Tracy took a plea deal and cooperated to save herself. In the end, that was all she had ever been good at. The town had its verdict too. Nobody called Calvin a good man after that. Nobody waved at Tracy at the grocery store. The same people who once praised his generosity now looked through him like glass. And Emily? Emily did not become cruel. That was what surprised Daniel most. She had every reason to be hard, every reason to become a person who enjoyed ruining people. But revenge had never been the point. Justice had. There was a difference, and Daniel saw it clearly now. So when the legal dust settled, and the house finally came back into the Mercer name, Emily did something that shocked everyone all over again. She signed it over to Daniel. He stared at the paperwork in disbelief. "Emily, no, this is yours too. I know. Then why are you doing this?" She slid the pen toward him and sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where Anna had once cried over unpaid bills and forged paperwork and a future stolen in pieces. "Because you came back with nothing," she said, "and I spent 20 years building a life out of anger. You shouldn't have to carry the house like a punishment. You should get to live in it like a home." Daniel looked at the papers, then at her. "What about you?" Emily smiled through the ache in her eyes. "I already got what I wanted." "And what was that?" She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "A father." That broke him completely. For a long time, he couldn't answer. He just held her hand like it might vanish if he let go. Then, finally, he whispered, "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." Emily gave a small laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You can start by fixing the porch steps." He did. He fixed the porch steps. He fixed the screen door. He repaired the broken kitchen sink, the warped back gate, the busted swing chain in the yard. Sometimes he worked too slowly and had to sit down with his back against the wall to catch his breath, and Emily would bring him water and pretend not to worry. They didn't heal overnight. Real life never works that way. There were awkward silences, old resentments, nights when Emily still woke up angry for no reason, and mornings when Daniel sat in the dark kitchen staring at Anna's letter like it was the only map he had left. There were questions neither of them could answer. There were years gone forever. But slowly, the house changed. It stopped sounding like a courtroom and started sounding like a home again. Emily began bringing over old photographs. Daniel found a wooden box in the attic containing school drawings she had made as a child. All of them signed with the same looping handwriting and a little sun in the corner. He saved every one. One evening, months later, they planted a magnolia tree in the yard where Anna used to keep flower pots. Daniel said he remembered her wanting one. Emily said she remembered her mother saying magnolias were stubborn trees and knew how to survive bad weather. That night, Daniel stood on the porch and looked across the yard at the little tree swaying in the dark. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think coming home would fix everything." Emily leaned against the railing beside him. "Did it?" He looked at her, and this time, when he smiled, it was real. "No," he said, "but it gave me back the part that matters." She nodded, understanding without needing him to explain. Some stories end when the bad man goes to prison. This one ended when the people who had been broken by greed finally got to stop surviving and start living. Calvin lost the house, the money, the diner, and the town's respect. Tracy lost the comfort she had chosen over decency. The judge called it accountability. The neighbors called it karma. Emily called it overdue. Daniel called it justice. But his favorite part came on a quiet Sunday a few weeks later, when he and Emily sat in the backyard at sunset with 2 coffee mugs and the magnolia leaves rustling overhead. He told her about the years he had lost. Not all of them, because some memories were too hard to hold in one sitting, but enough. The prison camps, the transfers, the injuries, the fear that maybe his family had moved on without him. The moment he finally saw a photograph of a grown woman with Anna's eyes and knew he had to come home no matter how long it took. Emily listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I used to hate you." Daniel nodded. "I know. I don't anymore." His throat tightened. She looked out at the fading sky and added, "I think I hated the part of myself that still hoped." Daniel closed his eyes for a second. "I'm sorry I made you wait." Emily turned to him then, and for the first time since he had returned, her smile was completely unguarded. "You did wait," she said. "You just didn't know it." The sun dropped lower. The magnolia tree cast a long shadow across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed, carrying its own cargo of grief and hope and people trying to get home. Daniel leaned back in his chair and let the silence settle around him. 20 years had taken everything from him, except the stubborn little spark that kept pushing him back toward this house, this porch, this daughter. And in the end, that stubbornness had been stronger than greed, stronger than lies, stronger than the brother who tried to bury him, stronger than the town that believed what was convenient, stronger even than war, because Daniel Mercer had come home. And Emily Mercer, the daughter everyone thought was too quiet to fight, had shocked them all by doing the one thing nobody expected. She had refused to let the dead stay buried, not for money, not for revenge alone, but for truth, for her mother, for her father, for the years Calvin stole and could never give back. And when the dust finally settled, when the court papers were signed and the prison doors closed and the house stood in the warm evening light like it had been waiting all along, Daniel looked at Emily across the porch and felt something he had not felt in 20 years. Peace. Not perfect peace. Not the kind that erases the past. The real kind. The kind that comes after justice. The kind that comes after a daughter looks her father in the eye, after 20 years of silence, and says, "I found you." And this time, he was finally home.